So welcome, everyone. I'm really glad that you're all here. It's great to see you. This was a bit of an experiment for me, really, to think about how I can take some learning, some experience, some research, some thinking about the field of organizational development and just create a space for some of us to come together and chat and work out what is it that we're here to do together? What is it that we're here to do in the field of OD? So the structure will be that I'll just run through some thinking. This isn't all right. It's not all wrong. It's just something. It's an offer to you to play with and think about how you might resonate with it or not. There's no expectation of agreement. There's no expectation that you do anything with it. This is really just a space for us to be curious together. This comes from, I guess, my experience of having moved away from being both an internal and a systems OD consultant to now running my own consulting practice, which I've been doing for just over a year. And that's what we do. That's what we offer. That's how you get in touch. Always available for a good email or conversation. And I love that someone said the cat with the laser beam eyes attracted them. I have to say, this image was generated by AI. So there's a tool in Microsoft Office called Designer, which is an AI tool. And I asked it to create an advert for professional development for OD practitioners. And this is what it came up with. So AI maybe isn't going to take over the world in the way that we think it is, but actually I thought this probably expressed quite a lot about what I think OD is all about. And so, yeah, have a go with AI, see what it thinks you're doing. The reason I wanted to host this space today is I think I'm only just coming through the pandemic. I don't know how it is for you, but I think I'm just starting to go, what was all that about? And one of the things that I noticed is that myself and 14 others, including Jackie and Tracy, who are both in the room today, we undertook a really deep dive piece of research work as part of my doctoral studies. And we published some findings from that in an OD journal back in 2018. I published my doctoral thesis in 2019, and then the world changed. Everything stopped. And really the opportunity to talk about this work kind of vanished because everything changed. And I think over the last year, as I've been establishing myself in this space of working out what I want to do with my work, I sat and thought, how can we think about whether this still has relevance and resonance now that the world has changed? And as I look back into the research, I thought, actually, we were a little bit ahead of our time, actually. And so I'm curious to see, where are we now as organizations? Where are we now as organizational development practitioners or people in that space? And where might we need to go next? So today is really just about having a bit of space to throw around some ideas. You can download this. You can get it from my website. The paper that we published, which was called A New Architecture of Organizational Development in the English National Health Service. And for those of you who really want a good long read, you can actually download my thesis as well. And they're both on my website. They're publicly available, so you can do with them as you like. And saying something came out in 2019 feels already like it's 1,000 years old, but I'm really curious to see if it still has some resonance for us today. And one of the quotes that really stood out for me when I was starting this research was by someone called Michael Polanyi, who does a lot of work in education. And this really stuck with me. He says, "We know more than we can tell." And that was certainly my experience of both coming into OD and working with OD people through the work I did in the NHS. And especially in the last year, as I've gone to other organizations outside the NHS, there is still this sense of we know more than we can tell. And so today what I wanted to do is really tell the story of my relationship to OD, how we're shaping it as a community, and start to maybe change some of the conversations about it, or at least develop maybe a different vocabulary about it. Because OD has been around since the 1940s, and so much is written about it. There is when I started my doctorate, I suddenly felt like I knew nothing because there was so much out there that I was looking at. And a lot of the work on OD, a lot of the literature on OD is OD practitioners scrutinizing ourselves and our own practice. And some people make some amazing claims. And there was an article in the 1970s where one author said, you know, OD is going to be so special, it's going to exceed the importance of traditional functions like finance and manufacturing. Someone else talked about, this was back in the 70s as well, how OD people can really embrace technology, because in the 1990s and 2000s, we're only going to be needing to work 2 days a week because technology will take over all of our work and we can all just relax. So people have made some quite grand claims over the years. And yet the conversation about OD is still quite opaque sometimes. And some of the research shows that there's a bit of a gap between kind of OD theory and practice. So some of the research that we did a number of years ago, and some of the stuff I've been thinking about over the last year is, well, what does the world look like at the moment? And what's the world calling us to do as OD practitioners? And I'm sure you can add 500 things onto this list, and feel free to add in the chat anything else that comes up for you. But when I think about the world in 2023, both as organizations and as societies and communities, there are so many things going on all at the same time. The world is changing, which means organizations are changing. And the scale and the pace of change means that actually we need a core competence of how we lead and manage change, which itself is a bit of a paradox. We can't really manage change. But when you look at some of the macro features that are going on in the world, when you look at some of the very localized things that are happening, everything from micro to macro is happening all at the same time. And society is shifting. Organizations are not separate from society, they're part of society. So I've always believed that if, as OD people, we can improve organizations, then we also improve society. Often we think of them as separate. We think of our work self and our home self, or work-life balance. But the construct of an organization for a long time has been that they are an extension of society. They are the fabric of society. So I'm really curious about how we can make organizations fit for the future so that society is fit for the future, because in a number of ways we're taking some really scary kind of slides backwards. Also, what I'm seeing in organizations, I was trying to kind of summarize, like, what am I noticing in the organizations that I work with? And again, if these things kind of chime, we'll take a second to pause in a bit just to see what you make of it. But what I'm noticing is that in most organizations that I work with, there's some kind of divide. In the NHS, it used to be things like medics and managers. What I find in universities is that it's academics and support staff. In places like galleries, it's curators and hosts. There's often this divide in organizations. And what I see as an OD person is that I'm often brought in to talk to just one part of that divide. So how can we make this better at this? And I'm really curious about that, because what's also happening is lots of different forms of organization. So organizations merging or working in systems together, and others that are uncoupling. So there's both a specialism and a generalization happening at the same time, which is complex. And yet in organizations, often restructure is the first choice rather than reculturing. So rather than looking at how we do things, why we do things, organizations will also say, well, we just need a different structure. We just need to change our hierarchies or the way we work. That sometimes means that people get disconnected from purpose. And if someone's working in an organization and they don't really have a connection to the purpose, it can sometimes cause some fragmented relationships because different people think that different things are important. I get this conversation a lot about things like KPIs, and staff going, I just don't understand why this is being measured. It's not interesting. And yet there's a lot more being asked of people, and less resources often, and more time, more expected in less time. So there's a real wave of people who are feeling burned out in all sectors. What I also notice in organizations is that there's very little, if any, space to think. Just giving people space where they're not interrupted, where they can think, where they can talk, feels like such a luxury, even though we're still expecting people to innovate and collaborate and do things differently, but we're not giving them the space to think. And then I guess this is something that I really notice, for me as a gay man, I really notice this kind of turning tide on inclusion, where there's been a shift in recent years around the importance of diversity and equality and inclusion. I just feel like things are shifting, and organizations are kind of wrestling with that, about both wanting to be role models, but also not wanting to put their head above the parapet and to be cut down for doing something. And I'm also noticing, and maybe it's just always been there and I didn't notice it before, but if I'm asked to come in and do some work with a team of leaders or managers and do some OD with them, what I notice is that they're actually really thirsty to learn how to do that themselves. So I'm really curious about the role of a manager in doing OD. What is it that they can do, and what is it that we can help them with that might just equip them to do that? And so that's just some of the stuff that I'm noticing. And then when I compare that to our research group from a few years ago, and we looked at what is it that people are doing, there was this huge range of work that is expected of an OD practitioner, all the way from inductions to culture change, one very transactional, one massively transformational, from strategic change to mandatory training. From service improvement to mediation, all of this was falling under the umbrella of OD. And I guess I'm just still curious about that. When I look at what's going on in the world, what might be happening in our organizations, and what OD people are working on, I sit with some curiosity about whether we're aligned or not. And I really don't know. So yeah, I'm curious. I'll stop sharing the slides for now, and just to see, already what's chiming for you, what's clarifying something. Often we're now working in quite complex systems. So for some of us, particularly if we're working in organizations that are being encouraged to collaborate. So several universities that I'm working with are coming together into a group model. Obviously in NHS, we have ICBs and different kinds of partnerships. We have charities who are coming together to kind of share their resources. When you add systems across our lens of OD, actually practicing OD in individual organizations is really different to when we're doing it across boundaries. And we were exploring this in our research group because what we felt was that there was this stretch that shifted something from us being internal consultants to system consultants. Because in the past, organizations of models of organization were very mechanical. It was organization as machine, and we would come in and fix something and go again. Whereas when we're in the space of systems and complexity, actually, we don't have these physical organizations in the way that we used to. If people are working in all kinds of different locations, we don't have the building that we're used to. So we may not have the same boundaries, we may not have the same identities. And so for us, how are we as OD folk just holding this? Like in our group, we described it as like trying to pat your head and rub your tummy at the same time, because spanning these boundaries can be really challenging. And I guess that was partly what sparked my research in the first place. This was back in 2015, when we were looking at new models of OD. Did our existing way of working support this new transformational space when we're working across organizations? And it was a curiosity. I didn't have an answer to that. It was really about thinking, how is OD showing up in this changing space? And in the NHS, which is where we were doing the research, we were moving from medical models of care, from single organizations, to fixing patients and being reactive. we were shifting as a system to being more person-centered, more holistic, more proactive, working in different ways. And so our question was really, if that's the shift in our organizations based on the needs of the population, what's the shift in OD practice that we might need? So this, I was trying to kind of frame it for myself, really thinking about at the heart of that question was, what's the changing need of the population that's resulting in a need for us to have new ways of organizing? So sometimes they would be formal organizations, other times they would be collaborations, sometimes they would just be groups of people coming together, but there were all these new ways of organizing that were emerging. And we were really curious about whether new models of OD would be needed in that space. And I guess the answer that we came up with was yes, we need something different. So moving from the traditional models of OD where machines, cogs in a machine and we pull a lever and everything changes, and we'll come in and we'll repair something and we're sitting waiting for the client to come to us. We're often brought in really late. We're kind of an afterthought. We're given a task where we're leaping into action, and we're using maybe not even kind of dialogic methods, but diagnostic OD methods. We're looking for tools and toolkits, often doing it alone or doing it in isolation. I guess what we were looking at is, how do we work as OD people, seeing organizations as systems of interconnected networks, that we're not interested in coming in and fixing organizations, but we're interested in helping organizations to learn and to grow, and that we're not waiting for the client to come to us because we're with our client. We are there in the system with them, which means we can be proactive, we can be there early, we can use data to inform our action rather than just coming in with a task. And in our group, we then added something, which I'll talk about in a second, which was moving from diagnostic and dialogic to diagnostic, dialogic, and dynamic OD. And then something that I've been thinking about recently is, rather than just working alone as OD practitioners, how can we work in a more transdisciplinary way? So how do we actually bring in scientists? How do we bring in chiropractors? How do we bring in theatre producers? Really thinking about how do we expand the skills and the talents that we can bring into our own OD practice. These models, when you think about the way that society is changing, where more complex problems are facing us every day, we really need to think about the sustainability of our work. The model of the kind of the lone practitioner doing OD for 5,000 people may not be sufficient. Now, you're very welcome to have all these slides afterwards, and I have to lean out the way for that one. This might just be something to consider, like in your organization or in your system, what's driving the need for change? And then how is the need for change impacting the organization and the way it needs to shift? And if that's the case, then what models of OD are needed for your organization? Because often when we're recruiting OD people or we're bringing them in, we're doing it based on the past. We're doing it based on either what's worked before or what we know. We often don't think about the stuff that we don't know or what might be needed in the future. So I'm really curious again about how we kind of revitalize ourselves as OD practitioners, how we almost give ourselves a bit of a makeover so that we're a bit more current rather than just relying on the old stuff. Because despite all of that stuff that OD people are doing, I wonder how many of these quotes you might recognize. People saying, actually, at the moment, I'm just doing lots of to-do list stuff, reports, returns, board papers. Organizations don't get what OD is. We don't have a strategy. Nobody knew what I was talking about. This kind of question of identity, like, am I an OD practitioner? If I am, how do I know? I don't know how many times in my life I've had the conversation of, what's the definition of OD? Please, can we never have it again? It just feels to me like such the wrong question. And yet, this is what we're sitting with in our profession. These are the kinds of conversations that we're having when we're talking about ourselves to each other. So yeah, let me just stop sharing that and just get your take on that before I move on. I don't want to upset anyone by saying I'm not going to talk about the definition of OD, but please, can we never talk about it again? What's kind of resonating from some of those slides for you? Jackie, I'm just noticing what you said about at a bus stop and someone says, what did I do? And I said, I work in HR, just so I didn't have to explain OD. Do you know what I've changed now? I just say anything. I make it up. I don't care. They're a stranger. I've said I'm a spy. I've said I'm an accountant. It doesn't matter because I'm never going to see them again. But the important thing for me is if someone's asking me what I do for a living and they are a potential client, I need to know what I'm going to say to them. If I'm an internal OD consultant and someone says, oh, tell me about OD, I need to know what I'm going to say to them. So I don't care what I tell a stranger or a taxi driver. I quite like playing about with it and seeing what people would believe. The other day I told someone I wrote for TV. I have no idea why I did that, but it was funny because he believed it. He started asking me what I wrote, and then I thought, oh no, please, can we hurry up and I can get out of this cab. But for the people who I think it does matter to, I think it's really important that we know what we're going to say. And maybe that's why after all of this time in OD, I still get so frustrated with this thing of, oh, OD is complicated, OD is difficult, OD doesn't have a definition. How many times have I seen, even on, you know, professional organization websites that say, OD is really confusing, or there is no definition of OD, because I think there is a definition of OD. We just need to understand it for ourselves. I don't think there needs to be a single one, but how I talk about it is really important to me. So when I talk about OD, I talk about it as being organization consulting using behavioral science. It's about having a systems approach to change. It's in service of delivering organizational strategy. And that's it. It doesn't, I don't care who's asking. I'm happy to explain it in different words, but I'm just very tired of this conversation of like, oh, OD is really confusing, because how we as professionals talk about OD affects how our clients and colleagues create meaning about OD. So if we're saying it's confusing, they'll find it confusing. If we're saying we don't really understand it, they won't understand it. If we're saying, oh, well, it could be anything, they won't know how to use us. So I'm not really interested in a definition of OD. I just believe that if you're doing OD, you should know what you're doing, and you should be able to explain it to people so that they understand what you're doing. Anyway, I'm getting off my soapbox. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Yes, Sven, go for it. Come in.
Yeah, I was just thinking what I learned for myself. It doesn't say that I'm good already at it, but when you present yourself, that you mainly should start with what, in effect, do you have, right? Instead of saying, I do this, just tell them, what has the change done? What have you done? In this case, it would be when we are asked, what are you doing for a living? Then we could just take the example of our last case or something and say, I changed the organization to have this and this output.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say that what, and so how do you do that? And then we can talk about how to do it. And then you can come in the end to, and we call this, I call it OD, right?
Yeah.
Organizational development. But it's in the end, when you say, I am IT, I mean, I come from software development, I'm a software developer. Everyone knows kind of, okay, what you're doing, even though you can do so many things with it, but nobody cares because we know it. But I think in the other way, if we help them, first of all, to see the product we create, then it helps them to understand what we are doing when we go deeper. But most of the time when we sell ourselves is we have to sell our product. And I think this is, maybe something that will help us to tell what we want to do and to achieve. And if people need us.
That's a really nice way of putting it, Sven. Thank you. Because then it puts the person at the heart of it rather than the job title. I mean, I've begun to find it quite funny, actually. Me and my partner were at a friend's birthday party, and it was one of those things where you know the conversation's going to come up. And my partner's a psychic medium. So I know what happens. I know what happens every time. And this person came over and she was really friendly and she said, oh, what do you both do? And I said, and I must have been feeling a bit cheeky because I said, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Dan's going to tell you what he does for a living, and you're going to go wild. And then you're going to look at me and you're going to look interested. I'm going to tell you what I do for a living, and you won't understand or care. but you'll pretend that you're interested when what you really want to do is to ask Dan all about mediumship. And she kind of laughed and I went, okay, let's do it. And Dan said, I'm a medium. She went, oh, wow, oh my God. And I said, oh, I work in organizational development. She went, well done, or something, and then just went back to Dan. So there is something about actually people don't care. Part of me, when people ask, I feel like saying it's none of your business. Ask me a more interesting question. But it's important when people need our work. And so I'm unapologetic about the need to be really clear about knowing what we do for the people that we're doing it for. If I went to see a dentist and they said, oh, I don't really know what dentistry is about, I probably wouldn't sit down. So my kind of invitation and offer to us as OD people is, please can we stop shooting ourselves in the foot by going into a space and going, oh, I'm an OD person, but I don't really know what that is. Now, I'm not just being like a grumpy old man here, because I think in our research group, we talked about this so much, and then we came up with some possible suggestions or some solutions as well. So one of the things was about how can we pause and ponder this? So just some questions that we might ask, like how often do we really relate our practice to the needs of the business? How often do we think about what are the interventions that could address those issues instead of someone giving us a solution and then telling us to make it fit? And for me, that still happens. You know, someone will ask me to come in and do a thing, and actually when we talk about the thing, it's not the thing they need, because the issue that they thought isn't the issue that's really important. So I'm really curious about how we can contract better for this. Equally, how comfortable are we asking, like, who's my client? Why do they think I'm here? Someone got in touch with me and asked me to do some work, and I thought it was all about, you know, making the team more strategic and effective. And they said, no, we just want a fun day out. And I thought, well, I'm the wrong person for that. But so there is something about who's our client and what do they think we're here for? If we can't name who our client is, then we're going to have competing tensions about that. And then how good are we at knowing and maintaining the boundaries of our professional practice? So how do we know when we're reaching the edge of our expertise and when we might need to stretch or pause or refer it to someone else? Because often, I think Michelle said earlier something about the homelessness of, Michelle, do you want to say what you said? Because it was such a beautiful thing. The things that organizations should be doing, that we're all homeless priorities.
Yeah, we kind of we have the risk of becoming the home for the homeless priorities when you know, an organization's not sure where to put something, but they know they need to be working on it. OD seems to be that landing place.
Yeah, that's such a nice way of putting it. I remember reading a piece of research that once said OD is everything the organization should be doing but isn't. And actually how overwhelming that could be. So how often as OD people are we saying no, or actually that's not in my skills? So again, in our research group, we had this kind of three things, like, you know, what if we really understood the needs of the client? And what if we recognize the nature of our relationship together? Do they think that we're just an extra pair of hands? Do they think that we're just like a servant of power? Or do they really believe that we're here as a collaborative partner to help them think and understand better what the situation is? And then how do we notice that the tools that are available for us to use, and be deliberate, be choiceful about those tools? Oh, Nicole, sorry, I just noticed you've got your hand up. Feel free to come in. The moment might have gone, but if you still want to, please do come in.
Thanks, Paul. I'm sitting here listening with great intention, and there's a lot of what you're saying that I suppose I don't have experience of, and I'm kind of wondering about that. One of the things I really noticed, you've kind of cited a disconnection right up front. You know, like there's a set of people and there's a set of people. There's an organisation here and an organisation over here. And that pattern, I've noticed how that pattern's shown up in the story around our role and our relationship with the client. So like, you know, as an occupational therapist who's been around a long time, I mean, like that whole, I had to get over, what is it? How do I describe myself at a party as an OT? And then I find myself switching the T for a D, and lo and behold, it's the same kind of carry on that I have.
Yeah.
So what am I trying to say? I kind of wonder whether there's something, I found it helpful to declare intention. So I'm really interested in supporting your work in something that's effective and healthy, and it's going to add value in your organisation. Then there's some sub-bullets to that around behavioural sciences and a bit of the how. So I think the colleague who expressed that at an intention level, I've had success in expressing it like that. But it's inconceivable for me to think about any of this work without actually thinking about my relationship and connection with the client and how much the client is part of their own solution on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's just comes from walking into a university, goodness knows how long ago, recognizing that a patient does it for themselves.
Yeah.
I can't do it for anybody, really. And working alongside to sort of understand the kind of appetite, understand the fear, understand the opportunity, you know, help to hold a mirror and show patterns, and actually be clear about what my patterns are as well. So I'll just kind of leave it there. I hope that was coherent enough for some people to, you know, take something from it.
Thank you,
But thanks
Nicole.
for the provocation.
No, it's great. My best friend from school is an OT, and we always joke about, you know, an OT and an OD person walk in a bar, and, you know, it's just that thing of, and then, you know, who cares? And I think that's why I'm really glad, actually, about what I mentioned earlier about the thirst of managers to get to know OD. What I've noticed in the last year or so is if I've been commissioned to go and work with a team, and there's something about how the team can work more effectively, actually it's much more useful for me to help the team understand how they can do their own OD on themselves, rather than just going, so often I'm just throwing out the agenda and just going, well, what do we do now? Which I think kind of speaks to some of the stuff we were doing in the research group, which is coming soon. So thank you, Nicole. I guess where are we now? I think, you know, this storm can sometimes clear the air. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's, you know, there's an increase in speed and pace and complexity of change. There's competing organizational priorities. There's all of these complex systems that are working in a space, and that's our expertise. You know, that's the expert field that we occupy in the space of intervening in those social systems of organizations. And it's becoming more complex, and the challenges are more difficult, and the context is more challenging. There's some stuff in the research that talks about complexity collapsing coherence, and that's a good thing, because you need to collapse coherence for change and transformation to really happen. But often in organizations, there's a resistance for complexity. People just want simplicity. People don't like to stop doing stuff that they enjoy. People don't want to experience loss that might come with change. So there's a lot of energy that's needed from us as OD folk to really hold some of that, to hold some of the tension in the systems, and to work with some of the energy that might shift some of that. Also, it means that we, and I think this speaks to what Nicole, you were just saying, we might have to let go of some of our previous patterns, some of our beliefs, some of our practices, the things that have served us in the future that may not serve our clients, and things that served us in the past that may not serve our clients in the future. And that was something that we really focused on in the research group. We were thinking about this idea of, you know, what are the tools available for us to use? My initial thinking around this was that, and again, this is kind of speaking to that binary thing. It was like, actually, we've got this thing called Diagnostic OD. I wonder if it would be better if we used this thing called Dialogic OD, and that there would be a shift from this to this. And actually what we realized as a group is that they're both important, and there was still a gap. There was still something that was missing in this new, very complex world. So we added this third category of dynamic OD, which was much more improvisational, much more collaborative. It was much more moment to moment. And we then built around this framework a kind of a map of how you could understand, well, where are we? You know, what kind of OD might be useful for the space that we're in? All of this is in the stuff that you can download. So we created this thing called a blueprint, and I love that it's a multicolored blueprint, and a process for how you might look at this and explore it. So we were thinking, we based it on some of the complexity theory that people like Ralph Stacey and Dave Snowden had been doing, and then we kind of overlaid that with what level of system are we working at. So we were thinking about if we're doing some work with individuals or teams, if we're doing some work at organization level, or if we're working across organizations, then how do we know what form of OD might be useful? And we were basing that on, is it something that's kind of simple? Is it complicated or complex? And that we could then map that. And we came up with a process that people can use. So that's available, you know, that the pandemic kind of stopped our curiosity on this, but this map is available and the process is there for anyone to try out, just as a way of exploring that. And I guess one of the other things that came through in this research was that we, above all, are just people. Like, I love this quote from one of our group. She said, in my organization, I'm a gardener. I'm in my faded old clothes. Some people might not even notice me. I'm tending to the veggies and the flowers. It's seasonal work. I spend time in different parts of the garden at different times. I'm tending the garden for other people. In a system, suddenly I'm Alan Titchmarsh. I'm put in front of a camera with lights on me, and I have to talk about gardening. I'm on show explaining how to do gardening. I have to learn to read auto cues and look natural, and it's hard to forget about the cameras and be visible all the time. And we really, for me, this really spoke to this shift, both from organization to system, from diagnostic to dynamic, from, you know, being the OD practitioner that kind of moves around the organization, maybe in quite an invisible way, to being much more visible and at the forefront. Because what was also coming up is, and this is consistent in a lot of my conversations, is people saying, I'm worried I'm not having enough impact. I don't have enough time to reflect. I don't know if I've got the right kind of power and influence, you know, beating myself up for all the things I could have done. And yet OD is so needed. And it's interesting that when we are most needed, there's this kind of crisis of confidence going on. And one of the things that I think has become more clear for me is that OD practitioners can't excel at all aspects of OD, but often we think we should. And if you look at some of the models of OD theory, you know, the lists of maybe 50 or 60 different influences, we can't know all of that. We just don't know. We can't, there's no way. So for me, there's something about how do we know what kind of OD practitioners we need to be? How do we narrow the gap between theory and practice? And also, how do we resist being caught up in, you know, a new fad, or being kind of like, here's a new tool and I'm going to use it in every situation, because one size fits all also doesn't work. One of the ways that we approached that in the research group was we did an appreciative inquiry on ourselves. And again, these questions, when you get the slides, you're more than welcome to try them out with any OD folk or yourself. But they generated so much energy when we took the time to reflect on the best bits about OD, the best bits about ourselves. And often we come at this from a place of what's missing, what's wrong, whereas actually looking at this and basing it on our strengths was so powerful. If you've done any appreciative inquiry work, you'll know that there's a concept in appreciative inquiry which is called the positive core, which kind of hypothesizes that at the heart of something is this positive core that everything else can be built on. And Jackie and Tracy might remember the day that we were in this room and we had post-its on the wall and we started to think about all of the different strengths that we had as an OD practitioner, and we put them on the wall. And then there was this moment when the sun was setting and that happened. Like, we just had this beam of light cutting through the word strength, just as we were exploring what's our positive core. And I think we ended up calling it like the divine intervention. But there was something about, what does this mean? You know, if strength is our positive core, So we started talking about this as saying, actually, strength comes from creativity and authenticity. We talked about using strength as a way of being brave in our work, like how we could bring our love of OD really to the surface and use that to transform maybe some of the lack of confidence that we had in ourselves. And that might involve a bit of discomfort, a bit of struggle for some people, just to kind of really break out of that. But actually this strength that we can have when we bring that, when we bring all of our skills, all of our experience, it can add this huge amount of depth and breadth. So this was for us just such a powerful moment. I don't know, Jackie or Tracy, if you remember, if there's anything that you want to add to that, because I've mythologized it as this like moment when the beam of light appeared, but it was certainly a moment that I remember. The bit of work that we did after that, and this is where there's also a few more sort of solutions for you to think through, is then we thought about how do we map our OD practice. And again, there's some tools that we just never got the chance to share because the pandemic happened. And so they're available for anyone who wants to use them. I've just realized that every time I close that, I have to go back to the beginning. So that's a bit of learning. So as well as the appreciative inquiry questions, we also used a process which was about mapping our OD practice, because there's lots of different tools that you can use to map your OD practice. And also I added in a few different questions just to get some curiosity going. So things like, you know, during the week of 19th of September, how do you spend your time? What are you doing? And then we compared it. We were looking at the geography of our movements, which shows you that was pre-pandemic. Look at the emails you send. Who did you send them to? What were they about? So this was just about surfacing some of the ways that we were working. And then out of that, we came up with this idea of a compass of how do you navigate through this OD field. And this was kind of a number of suggestions. We ended up building this as a model, and there was a little spinner in the middle. In the research work that we published, there's lots of stuff that sits underneath this, which then helps people to think about how they might sort of integrate that into their work. We also thought about how do you understand your place in the OD field? So again, there's a bunch of questions that we used. These are questions you might use in a conversation with an OD team. I've used them when I've done some kind of work looking at OD capability. And then the other thing, and I'm still kind of surprised that it's not that well known, is that there is a global OD competency framework that the Global OD Network came up with. And it's really, really good. You know, we used it as a group to look at our average scores around strengths. And it was really interesting to see what we thought was our greatest strength, which was about consulting. And actually at the time, what we thought was our lower strength, which was about being a credible strategist. What we then did was we said, well, what's the need of the system? What are they asking of us? And it turned out that we might need to do a bit of rebalancing. And out of all of that came really our vision of OD professionals in the future, where we talked about our need to be mobile and agile, about knowing the roots and the history of OD, but also inventing our own knowledge, and how we can draw others into OD practice so that we're not just basing it on our own biases. We thought about how we can find this balance of confidence and humility, and how we can give our authentic selves, because this work does have a personal cost. So how do we look after ourselves and explore our vulnerabilities more? There was another questionnaire. There was a questionnaire that was published in 1972, which was the year before I was born, which is all about OD professional development. So we took that and we updated it a bit, and we started to think about how we can explore our professional development. And again, that's available for anyone who wants to use that as part of their OD work. So I'm almost through the slides. Where are we now? I guess when I think about where am I now in my OD work, although I get grisly about the definition of OD, I do believe that people should be clear about their definition of OD and their understanding of OD and their application, because there are three different things. And we can hold it lightly. We might need to grip it a bit more tightly when we're beginning to get a hold of it, but we can hold it lightly. And then thinking about the OD training that we go through, if we go through it, you know, and maybe we need to think about the training that we need. So how can it be focused on rigor and results, but not too faddy and tool driven? And then there's this tension, a polarity, I guess, of going back to our roots of humanistic values that have been around in the field for decades, but also how we align that to future business goals and what happens if they're in conflict, what happens if there's some tension there. One of the things for me about how do we continually renew our practice so that we're aligning ourselves to this new reality, but we're not just forgetting the past, we're kind of letting the past influence us, but we're really thinking about where we need to go next. And one of the things I'm really excited about, I guess, is how do we refresh our field? Maybe how do we move from OD programs to OD practice? So rather than OD just being seen as a number of different interventions or a program of change, how do we actually bring our OD practice into the space more? So I guess one of the things that we concluded as a group was that actually this idea of working across these multiple interdependent complex adaptive systems is going to be the new normal. And so we as practitioners have to stretch into these unexplored areas. One of the ways of doing that was through creating, we described them as like micro communities of learning. So spaces like this, I guess, you know, how do you come together in a space to learn together? There's also for me an encouragement that we don't just come together in space like this, but that we carry out some inquiries into our practice as groups of practitioners so that we can be building and rebuilding ourselves. So I know that that's a bit aspirational and you know, where do we go next? But that's where we ended the research, and I'm curious about how it lands now. So let me stop this.